There are some smells you never forget. For me, it's the scent of old wood, lemon oil, and sawdust. It's the smell of my father. It's the smell of home. For 20 years, that scent was the first thing that greeted me in the morning and the last thing that clung to my clothes at night. It was the perfume of Sterling Restorations, the company my father, Arthur Sterling, built from nothing but a set of inherited chisels and a belief that old things had souls. He believed that a house wasn't just wood and nails, but a vessel for memories, and our job was to honor those memories. He taught me how to listen to the wood, how to feel the story in the grain beneath my fingertips. He used to say, Clara, anyone can replace something. It takes a true craftsman to restore it, to bring it back to life without erasing its past. That was his gospel, and it became mine. I grew up in the workshop. While other kids were playing video games, I was learning the difference between a dovetail and a mortise and tenon joint. My first real project at age 12 was restoring a ridiculously ornate Victorian picture frame. I remember my father's hand on my shoulder, his voice a low rumble of encouragement, never criticism. Easy does it, he'd say. Let the tool do the work. You're just guiding it home. When I finished, he hung it in the main office, right above his desk. It wasn't perfect. I could see the tiny flaws, the slight unevenness in the carving, but all he saw was the effort. All he saw was his daughter. That frame is still there, or at least it was. Sterling Restorations wasn't just a business to us. It was a living, breathing part of our family. We didn't chase trends or cut corners. We took on the projects no one else would touch: the fire scorched libraries of historic homes, the water damaged altars of forgotten churches, the grand splintered staircases of Gilded Age mansions. Our clients didn't just hire us, they trusted us with their history. And my father, he was the heart of it all. He was a big man, with hands calloused from work, but a touch as gentle as a surgeon's. He moved with a quiet confidence that filled every room he entered. He was my hero, and I always thought we had more time. You always think there's more time, don't you? The day it happened started like any other. The sun was streaming through the tall workshop windows, catching the dust motes as they danced in the air like tiny golden spirits. We were working on the balustrade for the old city courthouse, a massive, intricate piece of oak that had been a silent witness to a century of justice and injustice. My father was laughing, telling a story about his first ever job, a disaster involving a runaway ladder and a can of varnish. The world didn't just stop, it shattered. The sound of the ambulance siren, the frantic voices of the paramedics, the cold, sterile quiet of the hospital waiting room, it's all a blur of noise and numbness. They told me it was a massive heart attack, instantaneous, no pain, a small mercy, they said. But all I could think about was the unfinished story, the silence where his laughter used to be. The smell of sawdust and varnish was replaced by the smell of antiseptic and grief. My uncle, Robert, my father's younger brother, arrived that evening. He swept in with a flurry of organized sorrow, his face a mask of practiced grief. He and my cousin Ethan stood beside me at the funeral, two dark suits offering stiff, awkward comfort. Robert was the opposite of my father in every way. Where my father was a craftsman, Robert was a salesman. He ran a small, moderately successful real estate firm and always spoke of sterling restorations with a faint air of condescension, as if it were a charming but unprofitable hobby. All that time for such little margin. He'd say, shaking his head. My father would just smile. It's not about the margin, Rob. It's about the work. In the days that followed, Robert took over. Don't you worry about a thing, Clara, he said, patting my shoulder a little too hard. I'll handle the paperwork, the estate. You just take the time to grieve. It felt wrong. The workshop, my sanctuary, was suddenly an alien place. Robert started spending his days in my father's office, the door always closed. I'd hear his muffled voice on the phone, using words my father never used. Liquidation, restructuring, maximizing assets. My cousin Ethan, a pale shadow of his father, would loiter in the workshop, picking up tools he didn't know how to use, his eyes scanning everything with a kind of acquisitive hunger. I tried to go back to work, to find solace in the familiar rhythm of sanding and carving, but the silence was deafening. The heart of the place was gone. A week after we buried my father, Robert called me into the office. The picture frame I made as a girl was still on the wall, but it seemed to look down on a stranger sitting in my father's chair. Robert folded his hands on the polished surface of the desk, a desk my father and I had built together. He gave me that smile, half pity, half something else, something cold. Clara, he began, his voice smooth as silk, we need to talk about the future. The lawyer has scheduled the reading of your, and all you can hear is the frantic, panicked thumping of your own heart. That was me, sitting in a leather chair that was too big and too cold, in the suffocatingly quiet office of Mr. Davies, our family lawyer for over 30 years. The room smelled of old paper and furniture polish, but underneath it, I could smell deceit. It was a faint, acrid scent like burnt wiring behind a wall. My Uncle Robert sat opposite me, a picture of solemnity. My cousin Ethan was beside him, looking down at his perfectly polished shoes, a little too still, a little too composed. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, a dry, rustling sound. He was a small bird-like man who I'd always known to be warm and kind. He used to give me lemon drops as a kid when I'd visit the workshop of my dad. But today, he wouldn't meet my eyes. His gaze kept skittering away, landing on the dusty law books lining the walls, on a water stain on the ceiling, anywhere but on me. That should have been my first real clue. He unfolded the document on his desk, the crisp crackle of the paper echoing in the silence. We are gathered, he began, his voice thin and reedy, to execute the last will and testament of Arthur Sterling. He read through the preamble, the standard legal jargon that felt like a foreign language, bequeathing personal effects, making small charitable donations. My mind drifted. I was thinking about my father, about the weight of his hand on my shoulder. I was completely unprepared for the blow when it landed. Mr. Davies paused, took a sip of water, and his eyes finally, reluctantly, flickered toward me. Regarding the primary asset, he read, the family business known as Sterling Restorations LLC. My brother Robert Sterling has shown exceptional business acumen over the years. In the interest of preserving and growing the company's financial future, and to ensure its continued stability with strong, experienced leadership, I hereby bequeath 100% of my ownership, assets, and operational control of Sterling Restorations to my brother Robert. The silence that followed was absolute. The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. I felt the blood drain from my face. It was like I'd been punched in the gut. the air forced from my lungs. I looked at Robert, expecting, I don't know what I was expecting, shock, confusion, but there was none. There was only a calm, practiced sadness on his face, an expression of a man accepting a heavy but necessary burden. Ethan, my cousin, finally looked up from his shoes, and for a split second I saw it. For whom I hold the deepest affection. I know her passion has always been for the craft itself, not the burdens of business administration, so that she may pursue her own path free from these responsibilities. I bequeath to her the sum of $50,000 along with my personal collection of hand tools. $50,000 and his tools. It wasn't an inheritance, it was a severance package, it was a tip, it was a profound slap in the face wrapped in the hollow language of love and affection. My father's entire life's work, our shared dream, valued in the millions, and I was being handed a pittance and told to go play somewhere. The rage came then, hot and blinding. It burned away the shock and left something hard and sharp in its place. No, I said, my voice shaking but clear. No, that is not my father's will. I don't believe it. Robert finally spoke, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Clara, I know this is difficult. Your father and I discussed this many times. He was worried about you, about your ability to handle the pressures. He wanted to protect you, protect me. I was on my feet now, my hands clenched into fists. By stealing my life from me, he would never say those things. Those are your words, Robert, your ambition, your greed. That's enough, Robert said, his voice suddenly hard as steel. The mask had slipped. Show some respect for your father's final wishes. Mr. Davies, looking terrified, pushed the document across the desk. The signature is verified, Clara. It's all legal and binding. I snatched the last page. I stared at the signature, Arthur Sterling. It was my father's name, written in his familiar, elegant script, but it was wrong. Have you ever seen a perfect copy of something you know intimately? It looks right, but it feels dead. My father's signature, especially in his later years, had a certain flow, a slight waver at the end of the G. It was the signature of a man whose hand was more comfortable holding a chisel than a pen. This one, this one was too perfect, too steady. It was the hand of someone carefully tracing a memory, not making one. It was a forgery, a damn good one, but a forgery nonetheless. This isn't his, I whispered, looking from the paper to my uncle's cold, unblinking eyes. You did this. He simply stared back at me. He didn't need to confirm it. His silence. The sounds of the city rushed back in. The traffic, the distant sirens, the chatter of people passing by. But it all felt like it was happening on the other side of a thick pane of glass. I looked back at the law office, then in the direction of the workshop. My home. It wasn't mine anymore. I wasn't Clara Sterling, the heir to a legacy. I was just Clara. And I had nothing, absolutely nothing. You know, betrayal never really happens in a single moment. That moment in the lawyer's office, that was just the grand finale. It was the curtain falling on a play that had been running in the shadows for 30 years. The real betrayal is a slow growing thing. It's a weed that starts as a tiny, barely noticeable seed of jealousy and grows in the dark, fed by resentment and watered with whispered insults, until its roots have cracked the very foundation of a family. To understand how my Uncle Robert could do what he did, you have to understand the man he was, and the man he could never be, my father. My father, Arthur, was a creator. He saw a piece of aged, weather-beaten timber and saw a story waiting to be told. He saw potential. He saw beauty. My Uncle Robert, he saw board feet. He saw profit margins. You've probably met someone like him. He's the kind of man who walks into a cathedral and doesn't look up at the vaulted ceilings. He calculates the cost of the real estate. His mind was a ledger of profits and losses. He couldn't comprehend doing something for the love of it, for the legacy it would leave behind. To him, passion was just a liability, an inefficient use of time and resources. I remember one Thanksgiving years ago. I must have been about 16. My dad had just finished the restoration of the main reading room at the public library. It was a masterpiece. He'd spent 6 months painstakingly recreating the original hand-carved mahogany panels that had been destroyed in a fire decades earlier. He was glowing with pride, not because of the money, but because he'd given a piece of the city's soul back to its people. At the dinner table, Robert raised his wine glass in a toast. "To Arthur," he said, his smile thin as a razor. "The only man I know who would spend a fortune to make a library look old again." It sounded like a compliment, but it was a jab. A perfectly crafted insult disguised as a toast. He was belittling my father's life's work, reducing a triumph of artistry to a poor business decision. My father just smiled, that sad, knowing smile of his, and said, "Some things are worth more than they cost, Rob." Robert just shook his head and took a sip of wine. They were speaking two different languages. He was always in my father's shadow, and he hated it. My grandfather, a carpenter himself, had seen the artist in my... He built a moderately successful real estate business, but it was a business of transactions, of flipping properties and developing bland, soulless suburbs. It had no legacy, no soul. And every award Sterling Restorations won, every newspaper article that praised my father's work, was another shovel of dirt on the coffin of Robert's own self-worth. And then there was Ethan. My cousin was not the architect of this betrayal, but he was the willing accomplice. He was the product of his father's bitterness, raised on a steady diet of resentment. While I was learning to use a hand plane, Ethan was learning to calculate property tax yields. I saw him as family, a cousin to play with. He saw me as a rival, the heir to the one thing his father truly coveted. I remember one summer day. We were about 10 years old, playing in the workshop. My dad had just finished carving an incredibly delicate songbird out of basswood, a gift for my mom. He set it on the workbench to dry. I was showing Ethan how to make a simple wooden boat when he accidentally knocked the bird off the bench. It hit the concrete floor and one of its delicate wings snapped off. The silence was deafening. I looked at him, expecting to see tears, remorse. Instead, I saw a flicker of satisfaction, a small, ugly smile he tried to hide. He wasn't sorry he broke it. He was glad. He was glad to see something beautiful my father had made broken. He learned early that if you can't create, you can always destroy. Over the years, the poison seeped into everything. Robert would offer my father business advice. He'd suggest cheaper, inferior materials to improve the bottom line. He'd recommend firing a master craftsman who was too slow but whose work was legendary. He was trying to infect my father's company with his own soulless pragmatism. Thankfully, my father never listened. He'd politely thank Robert for his input and then continue doing things the right way, the sterling way. Each rejection, however gentle, was another log on the fire of Robert's hatred. He wasn't just jealous of my father's talent, he was fundamentally offended by his integrity. Looking back now, the signs were everywhere. The way Robert's smile never quite reached his eyes when he congratulated my dad on a new project. The way Ethan would sneer at my sawdust covered clothes. The first thing they did was change the locks. It was so simple, so brutal. 2 days after the will reading, I went to the workshop. I think out of sheer dumb instinct, the way a loyal dog returns to a house that's no longer its home. My key, the same worn brass key I'd used since I was a teenager, slid into the lock and stopped hard. It wouldn't turn. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the heavy oak door my father and I had hung together. On the other side of that door was the scent of my childhood, the sound of my father's laugh echoing in the rafters, the entire map of my life. And all it took to erase it was a few new pins in a lock cylinder. I saw a shadow move past the frosted glass window inside. I knocked. The shadow stopped, then moved away. No one came to the door. That was the moment I understood what exile felt like. It wasn't just being cast out, it was being rendered invisible. The $50,000 felt like a fortune until it wasn't. The first 10,000 went to a lawyer who, after a month of taking my frantic calls, told me what I already knew in my gut. The forgery was too good. Robert had covered his tracks. Without a confession or a witness, we had nothing but my word against a legally certified document. The burden of proof is astronomical, Clara, he'd said, his voice full of expensive pity. The rest of the money bled away. Rent on the apartment I could no longer afford, bills, food. It vanished like water poured onto hot sand. I was a craftsman. I knew how to build things, restore things. I had no idea how to build a resume. My entire life's work experience was tied up in a company that was now owned by the man who had destroyed me. Have you ever had to sell something that was a part of your soul? The first to go was my I'd wash dishes in the greasy kitchen of a downtown diner, the smell of burnt food and bleach clinging to me like a shroud. My hands, once skilled enough to carve a perfect spiral into a newel post, were now raw and cracked from hot water and harsh soap. I was living in a cheap, weekly rate motel room that smelled of stale cigarettes and despair. I was a ghost, haunting the edges of my own city. And the worst part, the torture, it was seeing them, seeing what they were doing to my father's name. I'd see Sterling Restorations trucks on the road loaded with cheap pressure treated pine instead of the reclaimed oak we used to use. One day I passed a historic brownstone we were supposed to restore, a project my father had been so excited about. I saw the crew Robert had hired. They weren't craftsmen, they were day laborers. They were using nail guns on 150-year-old mahogany trim. It was a desecration. It was like watching a surgeon perform an operation with a sledgehammer. One afternoon, I was walking past a newsstand, and there he was, smiling from the cover of a local business magazine. My Uncle Robert. The headline read, Robert Sterling modernizes a legacy. How Sterling Restorations is streamlining for the future. I bought the magazine with the last few dollars I had. I sat on a cold park bench and read it. He talked about improving efficiency, about leveraging new materials, about a new era of profitability. He took credit for the city courthouse balustrade, the last thing my father and I had worked on together. There was no mention of my father's artistry, only of his outdated methods. He wasn't just running the company into the ground, he was systematically erasing my father's memory, painting him as a foolish old man who didn't know how to run a business. That was the point I think I truly broke. Not when I lost the company, not even when I sold the tools. It was then, reading those lies, that I felt the last bit of hope extinguish. That night, working in the diner, the rain was sheeting against the greasy windows. I was scrubbing a burnt pan, my knuckles bleeding, when a new black sedan pulled up to the curb outside. My cousin Ethan got out of the driver's seat. He was laughing, slick and confident in a tailored suit, opening the door for a beautiful woman. They were going to the expensive steakhouse next door. He glanced over at the diner, his eyes sweeping past the window, past my face, without a flicker of recognition. I was just part. When you're huddled in a leaking motel room, your stomach aching with hunger, and the only thing you have left is the dirt under your fingernails, you stop being afraid of falling. There's nowhere left to fall. That night, after seeing Ethan, after the tears dried on my face, I was left with a terrifying emptiness. And in that void, a memory surfaced. It was a faint glimmer, a story my father used to tell about the man who taught him everything, a master craftsman named Samuel Blackwood, a legend, a purist, who had retired decades ago, disgusted with the modern world's obsession with speed over quality. He'd vanished, my father said, to a small plot of land somewhere upstate, to listen to the trees. At the time, it sounded like a fairy tale. Now, it sounded like the only hope I had left. It took me a week to find him. I sold my watch, the last thing of value I owned, for a one-way bus ticket and a little pocket cash. I took a bus north until the city was just a bad memory smogging up the horizon. I got off in a sleepy, forgotten town and started asking questions. Most people just shook their heads, but an old woman in a general store, her face a road map of wrinkles, remembered him. "The wood hermit," she'd cackled, "lives up on Whisperwind Ridge, doesn't like visitors." She gave me a set of rambling directions that involved a crooked oak tree and a dry riverbed. The last 5 miles were on foot, up a winding dirt track, with nothing but the silence of the forest for company. I found his workshop first. It wasn't a building so much as a part of the landscape, a low-slung structure of fieldstone and rough-hewn cedar that seemed to have grown right out of the mountainside. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, and there he was, standing outside splitting logs. Samuel Blackwood was a man made of sinew and oak. He was short, wiry, with a shock of white hair and eyes the color of a stormy sky. He looked at me, leaning on his axe, his gaze so intense it felt like he was taking my measure, right down to the soul. "I'm Clara Sterling," I said, my voice hoarse, "Arthur's daughter." He just grunted. "I know who you are. Heard about your father. A damn shame. What do you want?" I told him everything, the will, the betrayal, Robert's desecration of the company. I poured out all the pain and rage and despair of the past few months. When I finished, my voice cracking, he was silent for a long time, just studying me. I expected pity, maybe some words of comfort. I got none. "So, you got beat." I said, "Please, I have nowhere else to go." He stopped. He looked at my hands, still raw and red from the dish sink. "You have your father's hands," he said quietly, "but you have your own sorrow. And right now, that sorrow is making you weak." He sighed. "The barn needs mucking out. Bed is a cot in the loft. Work starts at sunrise." That was the beginning of the hardest year of my life. Samuel didn't just teach me, he broke me down. I thought I knew the craft, but I knew nothing. He made me spend a month doing nothing but sharpening tools, hours and hours at the whetstone until I could shave the hair on my arm with a 2-inch chisel. "A craftsman is only as good as their edge," he'd say. "Your edge is dull, girl, in your work and in your soul." He made me unlearn everything I thought I knew. He taught me the old ways, the slow ways, techniques my father had only ever read about, how to steam bend wood without it cracking, how to mix my own varnishes from shellac and seed oils, how to read the life of a tree from the patterns in its grain. The work was brutal. My body ached in ways I never knew it could. But for the first time in months, my mind was quiet. The physical exhaustion was a balm. The intense focus required for a Japanese dovetailed joint left no room for self-pity. My grief for my father began to change. It was no longer a weight that was crushing me. It became a quiet, constant presence, a source of strength. I was no longer just mourning him. I was honoring him with every curl of wood that fell from my plane, and my rage at Robert. That changed too. Samuel helped me see it not as a fire to burn with, but as fuel. It became a cold, clean, motivating force. One evening, after months of training, I finally finished a piece he was satisfied with, a simple shaker-style table. The lines were clean, the joints were perfect, The finish was like silk. He ran his hand over the surface, his eyes closed. Your father was an artist, he said softly. He made beautiful things. But his weakness was that he believed all people were as honest as the wood he worked. You cannot afford that weakness. He looked at me, his gaze piercing. You are ready, but I want you to promise me something. Don't go back to fight for what was yours. Go and build something that is undeniably, unquestionably better. Let your work be your argument. Let your integrity be your revenge. He gave me a new name to work under, a clean slate. He gave me a set of his own tools, tools that had been his father's before him, and he gave me a new purpose. The city was the same noise, the same crowds, the same indifferent skyline, but I was different. I had walked into the wilderness a broken girl, and I had walked out a woman forged in silence and solitude. I had a new name, a new purpose, and a promise to keep. The rage was still there, but it wasn't a wildfire anymore. It was a pilot light, a small, steady flame deep inside me, waiting to be turned up when the time was right. My first move was to disappear in plain sight. I rented a small, forgotten workshop in the city's old industrial district, a place of rusting railway lines and brick warehouses. It was a ghost of a neighborhood which suited me just fine. There was no sign on the door, just a small hand-painted name on the mailbox, C. Blackwood. It was a nod to Samuel, a name that grounded me, that reminded me of my purpose. I used the last of the money Samuel had given me to buy the best old tools I could find at auctions and estate sales. Slowly, painstakingly, I rebuilt my arsenal, and then I got to work. My plan was simple. I would not compete with sterling restorations on their terms. Robert was chasing volume, speed, and profit. He was in the business of replacement. I would be in the business of restoration. I would be a surgeon in a world of butchers. I took no ads, I made no announcements. My entire business model was a single, powerful idea, word of mouth. I knew there was a quiet, underserved market in the city, the architects, the designers, the antique collectors, the people who knew the difference between craftsmanship and cheap imitation. The very people Robert was now alienating. My first client was an old, notoriously fussy antique dealer named Julian. He had a magnificent 18th century writing desk that had been damaged in a move, a jagged crack running through its delicate marquetry inlay. He'd already been to sterling restorations. They wanted to tear out the whole top and replace it with a veneer, he told me, his voice trembling with indignation. They said a seamless repair was impossible. I spent 2 weeks on that desk. I didn't sleep. I meticulously matched the grain, inlaying tiny, sliver-thin pieces of exotic wood, blending them until the crack was not just gone, but a ghost of a memory. When I delivered it, Julian was silent for a full 5 minutes of historic details being destroyed in the name of efficiency. Robert was gutting the company's reputation, selling its soul for short-term profit. After about 6 months, I sought out a man named George, my father's former workshop foreman. He was a master carpenter with 60 years of experience who Robert had fired for being too slow and resistant to change. I found him working a part time job at a hardware store, his magnificent hands relegated to stocking shelves. I brought him a set of my design drawings for a complex joinery project and asked his opinion using my assumed name. He studied them, his old eyes sharp. He pointed out a structural weakness and suggested a better, more elegant solution. Then he looked up at me, a strange look on his face. "It's been a long time since I've seen work like this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not since Arthur," he trailed off. I knew then that I could trust him. I told him who I was. The old man's eyes filled with tears, and he pulled me into a hug that smelled of sawdust and justice. He started the next day. He became my first employee, my ally, my connection to the past. The tipping point came with the restoration of the Grand Regent Theatre's main doors. They were legendary, 20-foot tall behemoths of carved walnut, and they were in a state of utter disrepair. It was a high-profile public job. George and I worked on them in our closed workshop for 3 months. We didn't just repair them, we brought them back to their original glory. When they were rehung, the city noticed. There was an article in the Architectural Digest, a small piece praising the anonymous Blackwood artisans for their masterful, historically precise work. Life fell into a new rhythm, a rhythm of hard work, growing reputation, and quiet preparation. But I never let myself get comfortable. One afternoon, I was picking up a specific type of lumber from a specialty supplier across town. As I was leaving, a sleek black sedan pulled up. My cousin Ethan got out. He looked different, softer, heavier, with the easy arrogance of a man who's never done a day of real labor in his life. He walked right past me, so close I could smell his expensive cologne. My heart hammered in my chest. I pulled my cap down and turned away, my whole body tense. He didn't even glance at me. To him, I was just another worker in dusty clothes. I was still invisible, but not for much longer. The article about the theater doors had put me on a new list. 2 weeks after that close call with Ethan, a formal request for proposal arrived at my workshop. It was the letter stated they had narrowed the bidding process down to 2 firms, based on recent high-profile work and historical expertise. The final two were Blackwood Artisans and Sterling Restorations. They wanted a full proposal and a live presentation in 1 month. I read the letter 3 times. This was it. The moment I had been working towards, the moment I had been bleeding for. The confrontation was no longer a distant possibility. It was an appointment, set in stone. The month leading up to the presentation wasn't about work. It was about war, a quiet, meticulous, all-consuming war waged on drafting tables and in the pages of dusty architectural archives. George and I barely slept. We weren't just preparing a business proposal, we were crafting an argument. We were building a case for substance over style, for integrity over profit. I knew my uncle's playbook. He would come in with slick graphics, impressive-looking spreadsheets, and a promise to do it faster and cheaper than anyone else. He was selling a product. I had to sell a philosophy. The day of the presentation was cold and clear. The sky was a pale, washed out blue. I stood for a moment outside the grand Gothic City Hall, the building where the Preservation Committee held its meetings. This was it, the arena. I wasn't the girl who had been thrown out of a lawyer's office anymore. I was a craftsman with a new name, and I was walking into the lion's den willingly. George clapped me on the shoulder. "Remember what Samuel said," he murmured. "Let the work be the argument." We were shown into a cavernous, wood-paneled boardroom. A long, intimidating mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by 12 members of the committee, the city's cultural and financial elite. And at the far end of the table, setting up their projector, were Robert and Ethan. Years had not been kind to them. Robert looked bloated, his suit expensive but tight, his face flushed with the easy confidence of a man who believes his own lies. Ethan was a softer, more polished version of his father, fidgeting with his tablet, his eyes darting around the room with an air of entitlement. They glanced at me and George as we entered, a flicker of dismissive curiosity in their eyes. We were just Miss Blackwood, the small unknown competitor, a nuisance to be swatted away. They had no idea who I was. The feeling was intoxicating. They presented first. He was offering them a cheap replica of their own history. I watched the faces of the committee members. Some of the more business-minded ones nodded along, impressed by the numbers. But the older members, the historians and architects, looked increasingly uneasy. Then it was my turn. I didn't use their projector. I walked to the head of the table and unrolled a set of my own hand-drawn blueprints, rendered in ink on heavy vellum paper. I placed a block of reclaimed 100-year-old oak on the table, its grain rich and dark. "Good morning," I said, my voice quiet but steady in the vast room. "My name is C. Blackwood, and I'm not here to talk about budgets. I'm here to talk about the soul of this building." For 20 minutes, I told them a story, the story of Grand Union Terminal. I spoke of the original craftsmen who built it, the materials they used, the vision they had. I showed them how our plan would honor that vision, using the same techniques, sourcing the same kind of stone from the same long dormant quarry. I passed around samples of the lime mortar we would use, explaining how modern cement would destroy the old brick. I didn't just present a plan, I presented a philosophy, and then I sprung the trap. "But the most important part of our proposal," I said, looking directly at the committee chair, "is not what we plan to restore, it's what we plan to save." I unrolled a final, detailed schematic of the clock tower's internal structure. My research into the original architect's private journals revealed a critical detail, a secret known only to him. He was forced to use unseasoned timber for the main support beams of the clock mechanism due to budget cuts in 1892. He noted in his diary that he feared it would lead to a catastrophic structural failure in approximately 130 years. I paused, letting the silence hang in the air. That was 133 years ago. A wave of murmurs went through the room. Robert's confident smile had vanished. Our survey, using modern resonance testing, has confirmed it, I continued. The beams are riddled with rot from the inside out. Any restoration that doesn't address this isn't just cosmetic, it's dangerously negligent. Sterling Restoration's proposal, with its focus on surface level repairs, would have missed this entirely. I had shown them the difference between a contractor and a craftsman, between a man who saw a building and a woman who understood it. The room was thick with a new kind of tension. They hadn't just seen a better proposal, they had witnessed a public humiliation. As the meeting adjourned and the committee filed out to deliberate, Robert shot me a look of pure, undiluted hatred. It wasn't the look of a man who has been outbid. It was the look of a man who has been profoundly and publicly exposed. As I was packing my drawings, an elderly man from the committee, Mr. Abernathy, approached me. He had been a friend of my father's for decades. He peered at me, his old eyes full of a dawning confusion and familiarity. Miss Blackwood, he said slowly, his voice raspy with age, your knowledge, your passion for this building, it reminds me so much of an old, dear friend, Arthur Sterling, a terrible loss. Did you ever have the chance to know him? The question hung in the air, sharp and pointed. Robert and Ethan, who were leaving the room, stopped dead in their tracks at the mention of my father's name. They turned, their eyes locking onto me. And for the first time, they truly saw me. Time has a funny way of stretching and compressing. That single second after Mr. Abernathy asked his question, did you ever have the chance to know him? Felt like a lifetime. The air in the boardroom became thick, heavy, and absolutely still. Every eye was on me. Robert and Ethan were frozen near the door, their faces pale masks of dawning horror. The dismissive smirks were gone, replaced by the panicked look of men watching a ghost walk through a wall. They weren't looking at Miss Blackwood, the upstart competitor, anymore. They were looking at the past they had tried to bury. I turned my full attention to the old man, to the kind, questioning face of my father's friend. I gave him a small, sad smile. Yes, Mr. Abernathy, I said, my voice clear and carrying in the silent room. I knew him. He was my father. My name is Clara Sterling. A collective gasp went through the room. It was a soft, sharp intake of breath from 12 of the most powerful people in the city. Mr. Abernathy's hand went to his chest, his eyes wide with disbelief. And I am here to correct a crime. I let that word hang in the air. Crime. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from a business dispute to something far more serious. I formally accuse Robert Sterling, I announced, of forging my father's last will and testament in order to fraudulently seize control of his company, Sterling Restorations. Lies, Robert roared, his voice cracking. She's a disgruntled child throwing a tantrum. I have a legally binding document. You have a piece of paper with a very good copy of my father's signature, I replied calmly, but you made one mistake. A forger's mistake. You tried to make it perfect. I pulled a file from my briefcase and placed a large, high-resolution photograph on the table. It was a magnified image of the signature from the will. Underneath it, I placed 3 other photos of my father's signature from other legally binding contracts. My father, I explained, was a craftsman, down to his very bones. He believed in the beauty of the human hand, even in its imperfections. On every important document he ever signed, he included a tiny intentional flaw in his signature, a maker's mark that only he and I knew about, a small break in the cross of the T in sterling, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. I pointed to the 3 real signatures. In each one, the tiny flaw was there. Then I pointed to the signature from the will. The cross of the T was perfect, unbroken, and dead. You copied the signature, but you didn't know its secret. You didn't know the man. I then placed a sworn, notarized report from a forensic document examiner on the table. This report confirms it. The will was signed by a hand other than my father's. Ethan made a small, choked sound. Robert was just staring at the photographs, his face a mess of disbelief and fury. But I wasn't finished. This is where the story pivots. It was no longer about a contract, it was about a crime, and I had saved my best evidence for last. But I don't need an expert to prove who my father was, I said, my voice growing stronger, because my father left his own testimony. I looked at the committee. The last project my father and I worked on together was the city courthouse. A week before he died, as we were setting the final cornerstone, we did something we always did on a job that meant something to us. We left a mark. I pulled out one last photograph, this one certified by the city archivist. It showed a rough-hewn beam from behind the courthouse cornerstone. Carved into the wood were 2 names and a date: Arthur Sterling, Clara Sterling, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. You lying little brat, he screamed, his voice echoing in the ornate room. You think you can come in here with your doctored photos and your lies? He tried to sweep the evidence off the table, but George, my father's old friend, stepped in his way. That's enough, Robert, George said, his voice a low growl of righteous anger. The room erupted into chaos. Committee members were standing, talking in hushed, urgent tones. The chairwoman, Eleanor Vance, was on her feet, her face grim. Security, she called out, her voice cutting through the noise like a whip. Remove Mr. Sterling from this chamber, and someone call the police. Amidst the pandemonium, I just stood there, calm. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. I looked at my cousin. Ethan hadn't moved. He was slumped against the wall, his face ashen, his eyes locked on his father. He was looking at him with a kind of dawning, horrified clarity, as if seeing the monster behind the mask for the very first time. The bomb had gone off. The truth was out, and the house of cards my uncle had built on a foundation of lies was collapsing around him, right here, in front of everyone. You expect a moment like that to feel like a victory. You spend years in the dark, fueling yourself with a cold rage, imagining the triumphant moment when the villain is exposed and the crowd cheers. But when it actually happens, it doesn't feel like that at all. As I watched two City Hall security guards escort my uncle from the boardroom, he didn't look like a monster anymore. He just looked like a pathetic, deflated old man, his face pasty and slack with shock, his expensive suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for him. There was no triumph. There was just a profound, hollow silence where the anger used to be. The fire I had tended for so long had finally consumed its fuel, and all that was left was smoke and sorrow. In the stunned quiet of the boardroom, Mr. Abernathy was the first to move. He came over and put a frail, trembling hand on my arm. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "your father would be so, so proud." One by one, the other committee members approached, their faces a mixture of shock, apology, and admiration. Eleanor Vance, the formidable chairwoman, looked me square in the eye. "The city owes you a debt of gratitude, Miss Sterling," she said, her voice firm. "And an apology. The Grand Union Terminal project is yours, of course. Consider the horrified by the revelations, cancelled multi-million-dollar contracts overnight. Suppliers, fearing they wouldn't get paid, put a stop on all credit. The master craftsman Robert hadn't already fired walked out en masse, refusing to be associated with the tarnished brand. The house of cards didn't just fall, it was obliterated. Within a week, the district attorney's office had formally charged Robert with multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and perjury. His assets were frozen. The man who had stolen a legacy to play king was now just a common criminal facing the very real prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison. The most unexpected reaction, however, came from my cousin. 3 days after the presentation, there was a hesitant knock on the door of my small workshop. It was Ethan. He looked terrible. He hadn't shaved, his eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, and the arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a deep, weary shame. He didn't look at me, but at the floor. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I let him in. We stood there in the silence, surrounded by the scent of sawdust and honest work. I I didn't know he forged it," Ethan finally said, his voice cracking. "I swear I knew it wasn't right. I knew Dad was obsessed. I knew he cut you out. But I let myself believe it was real. I wanted to believe it. It was easier than admitting what my own father was." He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were filled with a genuine, soul-deep regret. Watching him in that room, seeing the proof, seeing his face when he was caught, it was like the last 20 years of my life were a lie. He took a shaky breath. "I came to tell you 2 things. First, I'll testify. I'll tell the grand jury everything I know, everything he said in private. It's the least I can do." My shock must have shown on my face. This wasn't a trick. This was a confession. And the second thing, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a long, sealed envelope, yellowed with age. "After he was arrested, I went through his private safe in his home office. I found this, hidden in a false bottom. I took the envelope. My hands were trembling. On the front, in my father's familiar, elegant script, were the words, 'My last will and testament.' It was the real one, the one Robert had hidden away after creating his forgery. It was the ultimate proof, the final nail in Robert's coffin, and Ethan had just handed it to me. "I'm so sorry, Clara," he whispered, tears finally tracing paths down his unshaven cheeks. "For everything." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't deserve it, and he knew it. But in that moment, He wasn't my enemy. Showed up at my workshop asking if they could come back, asking if they could help rebuild. My father's real legacy, I realized, wasn't the company, it was the people. It was the trust and respect he had earned, which had been lying dormant, waiting for his true heir to return. Armed with the original will and Ethan's testimony, the legal battle was over before it began. Ownership of Sterling Restorations, or what was left of it, was reverted to me. A week later, I stood in front of the heavy oak doors of the main workshop, the same doors that had been locked to me 2 years ago. This time, the key was in my hand. It was a new key, handed to me by a court appointed lawyer. I was no longer an exile. I was the master of the house. But as I stood there, about to re enter the life that had been stolen from me, I felt a wave of uncertainty. What would I find inside? And what would I do with the wreckage of my family and my father's dream? Walking back into my father's workshop for the first time was like stepping into a memory, but a memory that had been corrupted. The key, my new key, turned smoothly in the lock. I pushed open the heavy oak door, and the scent that hit me was all wrong. The familiar, warm perfume of cedar and lemon oil was gone, replaced by the chemical smell of cheap adhesives and particle board. The sunlight still streamed through the high windows, but it didn't illuminate dancing motes of sawdust anymore. It just lit up a layer of grey, lifeless dust that covered everything. Robert hadn't just occupied this space, he had suffocated it. The workshop was a graveyard of his philosophy. Stacks of cheap plywood were piled where racks of reclaimed mahogany used to be. Half finished kitchen cabinets, the kind you see in discount showrooms, were assembled with staples and glue, their laminate edges already peeling. The soul of the place had been ripped out and replaced with a production line for soulless junk. It was a perfect physical manifestation of his character, all surface, no substance. In a dusty corner, half buried under a pile of synthetic trim, I found it. The ornate Victorian picture frame I had restored when I was 12. He had taken it down from the office wall. To him, it was just a flawed, worthless trinket. I picked it up, wiping the grime from the glass. I carried it into my father's old office, found a nail, and hung it right back where it belonged, above the desk. It was my first official act as the owner, not a business decision. I sat opposite him, separated by a pane of thick glass, and saw only a hollowed out man, consumed by a bitterness so deep it had eaten him alive. He just stared at me with dead eyes. He didn't apologize, he didn't explain, he just said, "Your father always got everything." I realized then that he had been in a prison of his own making long before the state put him in one. I never saw him again. Ethan, on the other hand, chose a different path. After he testified, he came to me and said he was leaving the city. He didn't ask for a job or for money. He just said he needed to go somewhere where the name Sterling didn't mean anything and try to build a life based on something real, something he earned himself. I believe he was truly sorry, not just for what happened to me, but for the life he had wasted in his father's shadow. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive him, but I wished him peace. Some things, once broken, can't be perfectly restored. They can only be healed into something new. And that's what we did with the company. I brought George and all of my father's old crew back. We spent the first month not taking any jobs but just cleaning. We hauled out all the cheap materials, all the half finished junk, and had a massive bonfire in the yard. It felt like a cleansing, a purification. We officially merged my small company with the old one, renaming it the Sterling and Blackwood Restoration Guild, honoring both the father who gave me my foundation and the mentor who gave me my strength. And our first project, our magnum opus, was the Grand Union Terminal. It was more than a job, it was a symbol of our rebirth. It's a funny thing to look back on. My whole journey began with a single burning desire for revenge. I wanted to see my uncle ruined. I wanted to take back what was mine, but I learned something on that lonely mountain, and I learned it again in the quiet hours of my own workshop. Revenge is about settling a score. It's an act of destruction that leaves you standing in the ashes of the thing you've burnt down. But restoration is different. It's an act of creation. It's about taking something broken, something that others have given up on, and patiently, lovingly bringing it back to life. It's about honoring the past in order to build a future. I didn't get my revenge by destroying Robert. He did that to himself. My victory wasn't in watching him fall, it was in learning how to build again. I had to lose everything to understand what truly mattered. And you feel like something has been stolen from you, your job, your dream, your good name. The desire to burn it all down is a powerful thing. I understand it. But trust me, the fire that truly purifies is the one you use to forge something new. Don't focus on their downfall, focus on your own rise. Build your own legacy, one honest day, one perfect joint at a time. The rest will take care of itself. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight back from rock bottom, please hit that like button to let me know. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice and restoration. And please share your own story in the comments below. I read everyone, and they remind all of us that we are not alone in our struggles. Thank you for listening.